hearty gratitude to all of you for showing up to be a part of this story. My name is Libby Tedder Hughes, and I am the pastor and facilitator of the spiritual community who hosts you tonight. We are called The Table, and we nourish the spiritually hungry and welcome the curious into our studio of love by asking good questions, seeking good answers, and joining forces for the greater good in Casper and beyond. We know that there is always room for one more around this table because we act like it, and you are embodying that tonight. So thanks for being a part of our one more. The greater good of Casper is something we are passionate about, and this mural is only one example of the good work that this community has been up to. This mural was created with the purpose to inspire empathy and compassion as the greatest human power, sparked by the legacy of our hometown everyday hero, Reverend James Reeb. We anticipate that this mural will spark many more conversations like the one we're settling in for now about the ideals of our nation, the potential of our city, and the way that we can all live together into a greater capacity for loving our neighbors. We have many incredible individuals and organizations to thank this evening. First, thank you to the board, the leaders, and the participants of the table for being the kind of community that intuits what it means to love God, love our neighbors, love our earth, and love ourselves, and who generously give of themselves in a kind of love that takes care of the stranger and the friend alike. It's a powerful thing to watch this community in action. A big thanks to the table's annual sponsors who make this kind of work on behalf of our community possible. Those sponsors are Range, Solar and Wind, Mountain West Valuations, Hicks Plumbing, Platte River Injury Law, Todd Ingram, and Nicole Collier. And next, a very deep gratitude to the outstanding team of people who joined together to help make this mural a reality. As our program details, the mural would have been left only to the imagination were it not for the great assistance of our organizing team. Elisa Ruckel of Elevate Wyoming, who you heard earlier, Leah Reeb Varela of the Reeb family and Hinge Studio, Tony Elmore of Fort Atelier, Elliot Ramage of Beyond Borders Yoga and Adventure Retreats, Dr. Ariel Zebrak, humanities professional at the University of Wyoming, and Amanda Sherlin of Visit Casper, along with myself. We are truly thankful to the various entities who loaned both equipment, volunteer hours, and parking spaces during the creation of this mural. Lyle Murtha of State Line No. 7 Architects for the scaffolding, the Elmore family and World Wash for the power washing tools, Roadworks Industries for the orange candles, the staff of Bob Ide Land and Leasing, especially Jill Beza, Frosted Tops Bakery, the Wyoming Symphony Orchestra, our friend David, and the other many, many hands that came together to make this possible. Of course, thank you to the financial sponsors who invested in this project, believing in the outcome and the vision of what it could create. The Unitarian Universalist community of Casper invested considerable effort into the fundraising endeavor, joining us as a partner and seeking donations through the UU national fundraising platform Faithify, raising over $10,000 through that platform. The service this past Sunday with them, which was led and inspired by the Reeb family and of course the Reverends Orloff and Miller, was incredibly special. Thank you to Reverend Key and Laura Gossman and your board and congregation. To the Reeb family, we love you, we're grateful for you. Thank you so much. To Hinge Studio, to the incredible people and generous grants of the Wyoming Humanities Council and the Wyoming Arts Council, to the city of Casper who granted us support from their Community Promotions Fund. And of course, to Peter Wold of Wold Oils Properties, who generously granted the use of the east-facing wall of his property at 225 South David Street, believing that the beautification of our downtown only increases the value of our economy and our communal identity. Thank you to he and his office staff, especially Deneen Lang. Thank you also to the many journalists and news outlets who helped us spread the word about this story. Alicia Connor of the Casper Star-Tribune, Brandon LaChance of Oil City News, Billy Floyd and K2 TV, Good Morning Wyoming. We're also grateful to the Casper-based efforts that have sought to honor Reverend Reeb's life and legacy in the past. There is, of course, the park at the former Winter Memorial Presbyterian Church in North Casper, where now a garden flourishes because of the efforts of Wyoming Food for Thought Project. That church deeply formed Jim in his early days, and it now serves the purpose for which he would have been deeply aligned. And finally, but absolutely not least, to our artist, Tony Elmore, thank you. You have once again outdone yourself in bringing to life a vision as grand and historic as this. Thank you for embracing such a huge purpose and honoring the incredible life and times of our hometown hero. Thank you to you and your family for loaning you to us, and the many who came out to assist from your family. We hope you can put your feet up for a few days. Now let's turn our attention to the content of this panel discussion. Tonight we are here because of one life of one man who somehow understood that we as human beings are inseparable from each other. We cannot possibly pluck ourselves as individual strands from the tapestry that is our shared human experience. Reverend Reeb's rootedness in Casper formed his faith practice and his convictions that every human life and voice matters. He was a person born into the exercise of empathy and compassion of his fellow human beings, and he vested every ounce of his energy and purpose into serving others. He was, of course, murdered by segregationists in Selma, Alabama in 1965. He had responded to the call of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for allies to join civil rights workers in marching from Selma to Montgomery. What lessons from the life and death of Reverend Reeb in Selma, Alabama in 1965 apply to us, Wyomingites, in 2019? Then, as now, racial discrimination in America was a source of divisions of life and death consequences. Reverend Reeb was deeply shaped by his adolescence in Casper, Wyoming, and had a special connection to this landscape, choosing to have his ashes spread in the Shirley Basin. Wyoming's own history of division between races and ethnic identities is as much a part of our daily lives as our plains and our mountains. Reverend Reeb's life and legacy is one of compassion. Instead of seeing his fellow citizens who may have different backgrounds or identities from his own as other, Reverend Reeb sought to understand each person as human like himself, with needs and loves and dreams. It was his spirit of curiosity that lent him a greater capacity for seeking justice for self and those around him. He understood the depth to which Dr. King's civil rights leadership and work sought lasting peace. As Dr. King wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. In this panel, we aim to explore how injustices in Wyoming then and now lead us to seek the presence of justice for ourselves and for our neighbors. At this time, I want to invite our panelists to come up and join me on our stage. And as they come on up, we will be prepared to discuss with them what it is that this night means for our community. It's the panelist dance.
The orange, is that what's bothering you?
All right. Deep thanks to our sound guy, Dan Hauk, for all of his hard work this afternoon. Thank you, Dan. So as these wonderful folks settle in and Dan helps us figure out how their mics are going to be settled, these friends of ours now have traveled a long way. Ammon comes to us from Laramie. He said the last time that he drove up this direction, there was the typical blowing snow, so he was thankful for a sunny day. Our friends Chip and Andy come to us from Alabama, and Leah is our hometown girl. So, as we dive into the meat of this,
Thank you so much for investing your energies in helping us think through this tonight. It's deeply appreciated. And I wonder if you would please take a moment simply just to introduce yourself and share with our audience tonight what compels you about Reverend Reeb's story. And Ammon, can we start with you tonight?
Sure. My name's Ammon Medina. I work at Wyoming Equality. I work with the Gay Straight Alliances across the state, as well as, it's a nonprofit, so fundraising and everything that comes across our desk. Thank you. So I'm really grateful for my work at Wyoming Equality and what it puts me across the state. I think what's been most that was my alarm to wake up this morning. I think what most compels me about the story of James Reeb is that, that he went to state clearly his belief, that hate should not inform our rights and our lives. And I think what stands out the most is that his intention was to go and stand next to people advocating alongside of his own principles, and then to go home and return to his family and to continue living, the beautiful life he was living with his family. And that, there's a lot of talk around martyrs and, the space that they end up having in our lives. And I think it's just a really great thing to, alongside the gratitude for the sacrifice and alongside the gratitude for the change that is brought about in, folks like Matthew Shepard, James Reeb, to remember that they're human people and that they were brave and they stood up and they wanted to continue to be, around. And I think that's something that I've been thinking a lot about and how that informs what we do.
My name is Chip Brantley. I'm a co-host, co-producer of the NPR podcast White Lies. Thank you all for having us. I'm going to speak for Andy, I think. Thank you. Thank you for having us. It's really an honor to be here and to see the Reeb family again. I think Tony nailed the number when he said 40 earlier. That feels about right. But just also the extended family in Casper and seeing all you here tonight. It's really incredible, warm, generous community. And we're really excited to be here. I think to the question about what compels me most about Jim Reeb, I think if you've listened to our podcast, a lot has compelled us about the death of Jim Reeb and what happened after he was killed. I think to echo what Emma just said, the thing that compels me most about his life is that he was determined to do what he was going to do. He was not idealistic about it. I think he was realistic about it, but that he still took the time to spread joy with his family and with those around him. I mean, I think we've heard the word love a lot tonight. It just feels like that love was always around this family, and I think you could see it in his actions that when he blended his personal and his political. So, I think to Emma's point, I think we always need to be careful when we talk about his life that we're talking about not just what happened after his death, but the life that he led.
I will echo Chip. I'm Andy Grace. I'm the co-host and co-writer, producer of White Lies as well. We've spent a lot of time together. And it is just incredible to be here. I actually am familiar with Wyoming. I lived in Laramie for 3 years, went to graduate school in Laramie in American Studies between 2002 and 2005. And so Wyoming feels not like home to me because I know you're not allowed to be from here unless you've lived here for 7 or 9 generations. But
we'll adopt you. It's
yes,
okay.
Yeah. But I've always had really strong attraction to Wyoming. It's like Colorado, but without everybody from California. But
You know the good Wyoming jokes tonight.
if you keep doing things like this downtown revitalization, you watch out. You're going to be Fort Collins or something. I'm just saying. Just be careful. It's a tough. I'm just saying, this is a beautiful place to live, and don't let me tell some people in the East. I've really gotten away from the axis here. I apologize. The question about, there's so many things to say about Reeb's life. Although I will say, since there's been lots of really good things said about his life already, I think the thing that has compelled us the most in the wake of making this thing is really meditating and thinking about the legacy of Reeb through his family, which is really largely Marie Reeb's doing. The strength and courage that she had to essentially pivot from what is the most unimaginable tragedy that I, as the parent of young children, can imagine, and to raise children with such incredible empathy and such incredible love and such incredible kindness and humanity, I think is also partly James Reeb's legacy as well. It's certainly Marie Reeb's legacy, but I think that has something to do with James Reeb's legacy as well.
I'll say when I got to see Chip and Andy this morning and I saw Andy's beard, I knew he'd been planning his Wyoming trip. And so you're blending in well. You must miss Wyoming.
I do.
So I remember when I was little, I still have it, I have a book on Dr. King, and it was about I Have a Dream. And I always knew there was something in my family that was associated with the civil rights movement. I knew that my grandfather had been murdered. And so I had decided, I think in the 4th grade, to do Wyoming History Day. And my poor family, my grandma and my dad mostly, being here in Casper, I think I wrung them through like the 4th grade interview process and questioning, what happened and what's the story about and when did this happen and why. And I think my interest started in the story then. I've always known that there's been an absence in my family's life, in particular, my dad and my grandma, because and my aunts, I spent a significant amount of time. When we talked earlier about me having 40 people here and the Reeb family, it's an accurate statement. We're very close. We're very intermixed. We know everyone's business. But we love each other, and we come together throughout the year, no matter where we are, multiple times, and they're a huge piece of my heart. So I could sense the absence when I was really young. And so I just knew that it was an important story, whatever that may be. And as I went through school here, I knew he graduated from the same high school. He attended Casper College. We studied the same thing at Casper College. And I began to just try to understand his story on a greater, deeper level beyond him being my grandfather and my dad's father. And then as I got older, I recognized the significant loss and the struggles that my grandmother and my father and my aunts and my uncle, and that missing gap in their lives because of what had happened. I think the loss of a family member is tragic no matter what, but I think now in particular, me being a mother, having that splashed in front of you and the threats that came thereafter on their family and constantly being questioned and, the negative media and things that were associated with my grandfather's story, emotionally, I can see now how it took a toll on my family. And for me, it has always been to, make sure that was always at the forefront of my thought, but also to ensure that his story was out there and relevant, even to my generation and the generations below me, my nieces, my nephew, just so that story continues and so that they can live through a certain this story that is very near and dear to our heart and our family, but they can see kind of the greater good of that. And hopefully, as we've said through this mural process, spark some sort of empathy and challenge for individuals to stand up in situations where they may be uncomfortable, where they recognize that someone needs you. I cannot not do that in my life. And I have a 2-year-old, and I will encourage her to do the same. And so I guess for me, I'm always kind of aware of my family and the importance of the story of my grandfather, but also the importance of his story as a man, as a father, as a husband, and as a Casperite. He considered this his home, and he was involved, and everything that built up to his death needs to be shared, because it's in those moments of when he got involved in helping kids in North Casper, or when he was holding the hand of a woman, that had no one in a hospital bed in Philadelphia. She passed. or allowing a black and a white child to integrate a bus together at the YMCA in Philadelphia, or trying to get housing codes set up so that they were equal in Boston. And all of these things that led up to that moment he decided to go to Selma is what is impactful for me, and making sure that story kind of stays alive.
It's so powerful to hear you kind of across the years, right, come to terms with and understand your grandfather's place in your family and then in your own. But of course, you only got to know him after his death. You didn't have the opportunity to know him in person. And you've just done a really beautiful job of highlighting some of those, scenes from his life. Can you name what is your sense of what motivated his action, and what kind of kept him ticking? What was that?
Yeah, so obviously I can only come to a conclusion about what I think motivated him in talks with my family and the people that were closest to him in growing up here, or even through kind of the process of what Chip and Andy went through and uncovering stories about his life. And so when I have studied him and learned about who he was as a young man and growing up here, the thing that always resonates with me and that I think about constantly is that, he got very ill as a young child with a flu and then rheumatic fever. And so he was very tall and thin, and he had a slightly crossed eye, and he wore thicker glasses as a young boy. And there's parts in the book about him called No Greater Love that was written by a friend, Duncan Howlett, that talks about him being aware of him being different, and maybe it be how he looked different. He was also very convicted and in what he believed in, and he wasn't afraid to eloquently state what he thought was right. And so that also set him apart, just being willing to put his thoughts out there in front of people and be judged, regardless of what that may be. Those things, I think, set him apart. Our last name was actually Reeb, and he changed that when he decided to become a minister, to be taken more seriously, and adopted a family name of Reeb. So I think those moments of knowing that, people were judging him based on the way he looked or the way that he believed had to have somehow sparked something in him to then recognize there were other things happening in other people's lives that he felt empathy for. And so because of that, he kind of set himself on a track at a young age, like I said, working in North Casper or ministering, while he was still in high school, filling in in lay ministry in churches here in Casper when ministers were gone. I can't imagine myself as a 16, 17-year-old doing that. It's incredible to me. It's not, I can't fathom it. And so for that, I think, in my opinion, there had to have been something there that changed. And I will say, he was very handsome. Those glasses and that bow tie are a standard James Reeb thing, and we always chuckle about it in our family, but he ended up having corrective eye surgery and kept those beautiful glasses. And, when we all look at his pictures, we're like, phew, he was a handsome man. Grandma, so good job.
It's a pretty incredible thing for a human being to take their experiences of being other and find a way to empathize. And he seemed to just kind of have an ever-increasing capacity for that, and he just kept leaning into that. Thank you for helping us understand him a little bit more. Chip and Andy, y'all became obsessed with the story of Reverend Reeb, and in particular, the ramifications of the outcome of the trial in which his attackers were tried for murder and acquitted. The name of your podcast is White Lies. And your journalism led you to uncover and name the lie that was believed by many white residents of Selma since 1965. Can you describe for us what the root of that lie was and how you observed its consequences in Selma?
Yeah, so for those of you who are not familiar with the story, basically, Jim Reeb went to Selma in March of 1965, was beaten on the streets in Selma, died 2 days later in Birmingham. And pretty much right away, there was what we began to call the counter-narrative. There was a conspiracy theory, another version of the events of what happened to him that night, that sought not only to absolve the three men who were eventually tried for his murder later that year in December of 1965, but absolve the town itself and absolve Selma from really any responsibility for the environment and the circumstances that led civil rights activists to be there in the first place. So when we got interested in this story, we are both from Alabama. We were born after the events of the civil rights movement proper. We were born in the 1970s. And growing up in Alabama, we heard nothing about Jim Reeb, didn't know the name Jim Reeb, had never been to Selma. This was a story that was not familiar to us, it had not been taught to us. And as soon as we heard about this, we began to wonder about that. Why have we never heard this story before? Why have we never heard this part of the story before? And then as we went to Selma and began to look into it, immediately, right away, in 2014-15, we heard an articulation of this counter-narrative. We heard somebody say, oh, well, somebody actually, he didn't die here in Selma, somebody killed him on the way to Birmingham. That was the counter-narrative, that the civil rights movement itself had something to do with the murder of Jim Reeb so that it could get voting rights legislation passed. That was the meat of the counter-narrative. And it wasn't something that had just been articulated in the past and stayed in the past. It's still very much alive. It was alive when we began to report this project in 2014, and it's still very much alive. I was telling these guys today that a friend of mine from Birmingham who's around my age texted me a couple of weeks ago. He's listened to the podcast, loves the podcast. He ran into a buddy of his from Selma who was our age and said, hey, have you listened to White Lies yet? And he said, I don't care what those guys say. The man was killed on the way to Birmingham. Like, just people refuse to acknowledge the truth still. And so as journalists, when we heard this counter-narrative very early on in our reporting, the other journalists in the room here will know this feeling that you just have to dig in because it is enticing to know why this still exists. And I think there are all sorts of reasons about for why this lie has persisted for so long. Maybe, Andy, you can talk about some of those.
That was a really good tee up there. Thank you.
Yeah, you're like, I was giving you the eyes, but you weren't looking at me, so you would have known had you been looking.
Yeah, that was the signature thing about the story that drove us to know that there was something deeper and maybe not necessarily more interesting, but certainly something more universal about what had happened to Reeb. And I think that, we've talked a lot about why that story worked and why it hooked into the community. And I think it has a lot to do with shame that people feel about it's the same shame that a lot of white people feel about the sin of slavery, essentially. This refusal to really deal with the consequences of something awful that's happened. And people in Selma feel very, very defensive about white people in Selma, feel very defensive about the way they've been portrayed in the national media. This didn't start on March 8th, 1965. It started 7th, rather, with Bloody Sunday. It started well before that. The Department of Justice had been in Selma looking at the consequences of their voter discrimination stuff. Selma was already on the map, really, in many ways, not only for civil rights organizations, but also for white supremacist organizations wanting to sort of double down. The Citizens Council was started in Selma, the Alabama Citizens Council. So it was a place that already was bracing for a resistance to any sort of integration. And when this terrible thing happened to such a good man, this person that was impossible to impugn who he was, you could maybe think that his motives weren't good, but how would you say anything bad about this person? The idea that there would be a story that would help absolve you, it felt universal to us that Selma had done this, and to understand what it would take to get people to not believe that anymore felt like part of what journalism is supposed to do, which is to ask questions about a very specific incident in hopes that the answers to that question elucidate some broader unfairness or some broader fairness or some broader awareness about the world. So I think that's partly what we sort of dug in.
Yeah, we couldn't budge anyone on ideological grounds just by debating them. I think we've all seen that has limited efficiency and efficacy in this country. But what we could do is really just go fact check the counter narrative on a really granular basis. And all the claims that were made in the wake of Reverend Reeb's murder about what really happened to him and about the fact that he may have been killed on the way to Birmingham, all the arguments made in the so-called counter narrative, they're all fact checkable. And so we just took it upon ourselves to do that. That was really what drove us to dig into this story, is just say we can hold all these up and we can determine whether they are true or false, and we can go from there.
Thank you. Ammon, you describe using your writing as a tool to help people empathize with human beings who are oppressed by social inequity. Can you help us understand the kinds of social inequity that you're observing in Wyoming today, the so-called equality state, and what troubles you about these inequities, and what gives you hope about what you're observing around our state?
Yeah, I think the kind of inequity that I see is, a direct link, right, to my main thought when I was listening to White Lies, and it's denial, right? Denial that, the straightest line that I saw was this counter-narrative that comes about in the wake of Matthew Shepard's death, that he was a drug dealer, that he was on meth, and it was a drug deal gone wrong. And that narrative does the exact same work that the narrative Selma tells about needing, a martyr for voting. And that narrative allows Laramie and Casper and all of Wyoming, right, to say, well, it wasn't hate, right? It wasn't homophobia. It was just, a couple of bad apples. I think the denial that racism is overt in Wyoming still is really corrosive. Every black person I know and have talked to in Laramie, I can speak for Laramie, I can't hear it, right, has had the N-word yelled at them from cars, right? I'm Latinx, I pass a lot of times, and I've had things yelled at me from cars. The inequity of our gender wage gap, right? And that the whole experience of transgender folks that are living here, I think if we look at the national picture of the social inequities that are nationwide, they're alive and well here. And I think what gives me hope is empathy. If we tell the stories, then we can change. And I say that from my own personal experience. I grew up very religious. I grew up Mormon in a very white town in Utah, and I had said in the past, I think black entertainment television is reverse racism, It's not, because the rest of the programming is white entertainment television. But I have moved, right? And I grew up thinking, homosexual relationships were not okay and an abomination, and now I'm out, right? There's opportunities to make movements, and those movements come from interacting with our own community, whether that's in our local high schools, making changes, whether that's just talking. For me, it was talking to people part of the communities, and realizing, oh, so inequalities affect you. It's affected you in my own hometown, right? And talking to my friends in Wyoming, and talking to queer folks across Wyoming, and women across Wyoming about their experiences and how our community affects them. And I think just listening gives me a lot of hope, because people change when they listen, because you don't want to hurt your neighbor, right? When it's a grand scale, it's harder. It's easier to dismiss. But when it's your neighbor, you want to change it so that they feel loved and welcome in our home.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes me hopeful too. And I think spaces like this increase that hope and that capacity to be able to hear and to do the hard work. We talk around the table a lot when we set our ground rules every week. We talk about when the going gets tough, turn to wonder, and taking a posture of, I wonder what's happening with that person right now, rather than using that judgmental front, in order to just take the posture of discovery and question before an immediate judgment. So that's powerful. Thank you. Leah, your grandfather seemed to intuit that there was something beyond just loving his neighbor, that there was something that needed to be both embodied and enacted in kind of who he chose to be in the world. He had this way of seeing a need, meeting it, actively going after a solution in order to not let the things that worried him simply worry him. Can you share a story with us from his life that illustrates that understanding of like, yes, love, but as Cornel West says, that justice is what love looks like in public? Can you share a story with us about that illustrates that?
I can. I have two that come to mind when you ask that question that are kind of favorites of mine that I've learned about through, again, the book and stories and letters. The first one was about their time when they lived in Philadelphia. So he was a chaplain at the Philadelphia General Hospital. And the first one is about at that time when he was at the hospital, there was a black woman that was very ill and ended up passing, and he would regularly go visit her. And she never had anybody come see her. She was always alone. And at one point, he was out in the yard, in the neighbor's yard, picking the neighbor's flowers. And she said, why are you picking my flowers? Jim, what's going on? And he said, there's a woman at the hospital, a black woman, and she has passed. And I'm going to give her a funeral, even though I know it's only going to be me. And I feel that it's right that I provide this to her, and I'm going to give her flowers, and it's going to be me and her. And I will always remember that story of just taking the time to honor somebody that no one else is around to do. And the second one that always makes me kind of giggle is he worked as a youth director at the YMCA. And when he got there were a lot of issues with the program, but one of them is that they didn't have any sort of proper busing system, and the busing system that they did have was segregated. And so, of course, he thought, well, that's no longer going to happen. So as he built this program, he would regularly take my grandma in his station wagon and use it as the bus to get black and white and Latino children onto the same car ride to get to the YMCA to ensure that they would get to their programming. And to me, I think that speaks of love and empathy and justice all at the same time. He's providing opportunities for these kids to be around each other and understand one another and relate to one another, but providing that simple means of transportation using his own station wagon to get them there until he had the proper means of getting an integrated bus. So the first integrated bus of the Philadelphia YMCA was my grandparents' station wagon. And to me, I'm just like that little step, which probably, I know I had heard that there were grandma needs a station wagon for the kids and grandpa's got it out using it for integrated busing. I'm like, what? It's just a funny thing, but just such, probably he didn't even think what a big step that was in the 60s, the late 50s and early 60s, to be able to provide that to this program, this inner city program in Philadelphia. And they had integrated busing ever since. So,
thank you. Those are really beautiful pictures into how and why he operated. Andy and Chip, it essentially took the death of a white man in Reverend Reeb to change the heart of our president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, about moving the Voting Rights Act through Congress. Because as our mural depicts, Jimmy Lee Jackson had been brutally murdered only weeks before Reverend Reeb. In your journalistic effort, you openly questioned the efficacy of your inquiry into this fourth attacker, which is a part of the podcasting. William Portward, who was frail and he was sickly and he was dealing with dementia, so he wasn't all there. But you were also careful to describe how not holding him accountable, especially in his personal denial of responsibility, would mean justice could not be served in Selma. So my question is, if I can get to the right page of my notes. I'm getting there. Wait for it. The degree to which the white Selma community conspired to cover up what had actually happened in Reverend Reeb's murder, in order to uphold segregation, literally willed that counter-narrative that we referenced earlier into existence. So, do you believe, well, let me ask it this way. What kind of reckoning is required to live into our national motto of liberty and justice for all? these race relations, like we've mentioned a couple times tonight, have life and death proportions. So what's required to reckon with this so that liberty and justice for all is actually possible?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we've been asked similar questions since the show's come out. I think that people have listened to the show, and it's been incredibly humbling for us as journalists to have the response that we've had, but part of that response has been people wanting to reach out to us to tell us how they're grappling with their own complicity in certain systems or their family's complicity. These are a lot of white Southerners who've been writing us, saying that, they a younger, he's probably our age, but he's of the post-civil rights generation, wrote about how he has always tried to reckon with the images from Bloody Sunday, knowing that these people were doing something just atrocious and horrific by beating these peaceful protesters. But every time he looks at those images, he has to also measure that these are the same people who brought his parents casseroles when he was born, and these are the same people that were the elders in his community and in his church community and things of that nature. So people trying to figure out, what does that mean? How can I both feel these things about the responsibility that white people especially had to uphold these systems and create these systems and in many ways continue these systems today? How can I acknowledge that and also not lose a part of myself? And it's really, really difficult. We read this, among many books that we read that don't make it into the show for one reason or another. We read this great book by this woman, Lillian Smith, who is a white woman from Georgia in Florida, who wrote a book in 1949 called Killers of the Dream, about basically her own experience as a white anti-racist in that time, trying to figure out how to reconcile her own family with the realities of her community. And she writes in it this beautiful passage about, she's at a summer camp, and she's just kind of been telling what she believes to a bunch of other young white kids, basically teenage girls. And this one woman comes in and she says, it would be so much easier for me to accept everything you're saying if I hated my family. It's a gut-wrenching scene, and it does feel a lot like that. So to answer your question, I mean, we think about these things as humans and as parents and as children and white people from the South. But I think our answer as journalists has been to tell the story, that we can't control what happens after the story comes out, but truth-telling is how I don't know how social change happens, but I think it has to happen by people acknowledging injustices and inequalities and unfairness. And if that's our job, to tell the stories of these things, then that's all we can do and sort of hope for the best while being somewhat, concerned about the future of our country. So we just sit back and do the work, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lawyer and civil rights activist in Alabama, Brian Stevenson, who's become a national figure in the last couple of years. He created the lynching memorial in Montgomery that opened last year. He's written a book called Just Mercy that I think is coming out as a movie like this fall.
Yeah, they filmed it in the fall, yeah.
And he is often, we've interviewed Brian a bunch of times, spent a lot of time with him, and like a lot of people, are listen to every word he says because he seems to be a kind of guide star right now. But he often says truth and reconciliation is sequential. And, we, as Andy said, think about the truth part of it. Of course, we as humans and as Americans and as Southerners, we hope for the reconciliation part too. But we feel like our part of that is like Andy said, just truth-telling. So I think a lot of times people feel like acknowledging the truth is harder than it turns out to be. And we definitely saw that a lot during the course of reporting the story, people who resisted telling the truth for decades because they were scared of what might happen if they told the truth. And then they told the truth, and in a couple of cases, of course, none of us can get in each other's minds, but felt unburdened by that lie that they carried for so long. I think any lie is hard to carry for any period of time, but a lie of such significance to carry for so many years is just soul crushing. I really do believe that, and I think that providing a space for people to tell the truth and to look for the truth. I think that's something that we've forgotten how to do a little bit, but to look for the truth. For all of these stories, for as many of these stories as we can, and not just these stories, but any story of injustice, the more we can do to provide a space for the truth to come out, I think the better. I think who knows what will happen. If the truth comes out, we may not get anywhere, but if the truth doesn't come out, we know we won't get anywhere. So I think that's just where we have to go.
My energies are around, I like that idea about truth and reconciliation being sequential, but I am also in this space of saying, okay, and.
Yeah.
And so I'm not expecting you all to have the answers, but I'm just musing out loud about the reconciliation part. Because it seems like we have so much more road to travel. And maybe a different imagery, not to oversell the table, because the table doesn't have the corner on the market, but I think there's something about round table spaces. I think there's something about shared food and really deep reckoning with these lies that have soul crushed us, that matters for our own well-being and health moving forward, and that we need each other's voices to think through it, and we need this space to name it, grieve it, and then like the creative energy that comes after that. That's where I'm just thinking about the and part. So I'll pause there. Let's keep thinking about the and part, friends.
Well, I'll add to that briefly, because it is something we've thought a lot about. It's outside the scope maybe of our journalism, but as humans we've talked a lot about it, which is what does it look like to right a wrong that's as multi-generational and as deeply baked into the fabric of a society as this one? And the answer that many people have is the truth probably isn't enough, that really there needs to be a change of the power structure too. Who has the power in a society? And I think that the way that the power gets consolidated among the hands of a few is that there is a limited awareness and understanding of the lives of other people. So empathy can do that, storytelling can do that, sitting around a table can do that. The minute that you have people that are able to engage with one another and think differently about their own responsibility to their neighbors or to someone across the city or across the country for that matter, the more likely they are to not hold on to power that much. Because it's easy to sort of tell yourself, I feel these things to be true, and I'm going to go back and live my life and not have to be challenged by these things because I'm a good person, because I believe these things now. So I do think that what you're doing in the table sounds like I wish I lived here in Casper and I could go to it, but it sounds like that sort of community dialogue I think is absolutely vital.
Do you want to commute? And what you just said sparked for me the full circle degree to which Reverend Reeb's murder held such significance, because he intuited that the power needed to be shared. And because he intuited that, he was willing to say, I'm going to go march for that. Like, I'm going to go demonstrate for that. And not because I'm the one with the power, but because the civil rights movement and leaders who were leading that had that power and were already doing it for themselves. They just needed the witnesses. They just needed the folks around them to say, and we are with you. We are with you in it. And so that full circle thing of Reverend Reeb knew that others needed the power too, and he was willing to demonstrate for it, and he was willing to show it in his work. So thank you. So speaking of the movement, Ammon, in one of Dr. King's letters, he reflects on how the suffering and the oppression that he was witnessing from Atlanta in Birmingham, so from kind of a distance, it became his own suffering. He was feeling it in his bones. And he said that I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to injustice. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Wyoming cannot escape its own history of division between races and ethnic identities. Where do you see this threat to injustice the most in Wyoming today? And how are you choosing not to stay idle right now?
Most is hard, right? We have indigenous peoples here who lack representation in a huge part of our society, But I think the thing that I'm seeing now that is most alarming to me is the spread of white supremacy groups, right? It's, there was a Nazi flag hung in Laramie. One of the schools that I work with, there were, white supremacy flyers put up at McCormick. We've seen white supremacy flyers go up at community colleges across the state. There are, especially in the case of the high school, it's just like incredibly sad to have, students asking other students to join a kids' Confederacy club. But I think the hardest part is that was taught by like a parent somewhere, that was taught by an adult, that was condoned, But I think that the work to do there, to not stand idly by, all the research says the best way to fight white supremacy, the best way to fight these ideals is to like clearly stand and with one voice say no, like not in our town. I think painting a huge mural towards that effect is a pretty great start. In Laramie and in Cheyenne, there were meetings in response. There were No Hate in Our Town campaign that was launched in the wake of those events. The school board listened eventually with organizing, because we had community, we had the community stand up, we had faith leaders stand up, we had the NAACP, standing right next to Wyoming Equality, because those were the two groups of students named, by these flyers. They didn't back down. They, when Wyoming Equality would talk to the press, we would say, queer students and black students are being attacked, because that injustice anywhere is, in order to have justice everywhere, right? Like, we have to stand next to each other. And, we had that meeting at the AME church. And I think that how to not stay idle is to know that when a problem seemingly affects our neighbors, that everyone gets up and says no. The GSA students, and this predates me, I don't want to take any credit, they advocate very strongly around the Wyo Say No campaign to fight the immigration prison that's proposed in Evanston. One company has left, which is great news. MTC is not going to do it, and now we have a couple more coming in its place to do proposals. So yes, it's a success, and I think it's important to take a minute to celebrate those successes, but also understanding that someone's going to come up in their place. And as Wyoming has clearly sent letters and said no, but I think that what I do is listen first, and I think the point is great that James Reeb wasn't going down to say, I have power, let me give it, right? It was you're leading this movement, you have collected a huge amount of power, and my voice can support that power. And I think as much as we can do that at tables, at churches, at our workplaces, to just, when somebody says something, to understand that a racist comment said idly doesn't hurt anybody, that it does hurt people, right? That racist comment does hurt people, and the only way we can get people to question is by saying something. And sometimes that looks like I have a close relationship and I'm gonna sit down and I'm gonna say, let's go have a beer and talk over a beer. But sometimes that is just saying nope, I was talking to a woman about how she had changed her mind. She'd come from North Dakota to school here, and she was in a class, and she just kind of offhandedly made a comment about something being ghetto, and she had never analyzed or questioned that. And her teacher, her response was just, nope, and just kept on going with the lesson. But that woman was oh no, what am I racist? What have I done? And went home and then sparked tons of essay readings. So, and re-examining and apologies to people in her life, and really seeking a new, inclusive, love-driven lifestyle afterwards. And I expected this like big story when I asked like what led to that change, and the story I got was I had a teacher that said no, So in the workplace we're just like, no, that's enough, and that can cause a big amount of change. So I think not sitting idly can look a lot of different ways.
Sure. The willingness to re-examine. That's what I hear in that. And like just the willingness to examine dearly held beliefs and or things that come out of our mouth that we didn't know were there. That's so good. Okay, so Chip and Andy, there were like a gazillion light bulb chills moments in the podcast. These like lightning sharp moments in time when you couldn't help but just like either like pause the podcast to take in what just happened or like re-listen if you needed to. One of those for me was when you're speaking with Joanne Bland, who is a Selmian from start to finish and a civil rights activist and does incredible work there. And y'all are at the Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma there's a marker honoring the deaths connected to the Selma struggle there. And specifically, she balks at the language of "they gave their lives." She retorts by saying, "They didn't give anything. They were murdered by hateful, racist people," she says. "Their lives were taken, not given. They were taken." Why is it important not to whitewash the brutality and the tragedy of racism?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that the dirty business of radio editing is that what she says after that, which is that softens it. When you whitewash it, when you say their lives were they gave their lives instead of their lives were taken, you're softening what happened. You're making it feel like it was voluntary. You're making it feel like something that they wanted to do. We were talking about this earlier today. Jim Reeb didn't go to Selma to die. Viola Lusa didn't go to Selma to die. Jimmy Lee Jackson didn't go on a night march to be shot and to die and to become a martyr for the civil rights movement. It's just ridiculous. And when we're talking about anything, but especially when we're talking about something that is so baked into our culture, so baked into our society, we have to look at it, I feel like, glassy-eyed. And I think that's what, when you soften it, when you whitewash this history, you are not doing that. Brian Stevenson, I hate to be the person who keeps referencing Brian Stevenson, but who's better?
Yeah.
But he talks about the way, he says that the way we often talk about the civil rights movement is the 3-day carnival where, Rosa Parks refused to go to the back of the bus, and then there were a bunch of march on Washington, and then, the Voting Rights Act was signed, and then racism was over, and everybody got their freedom. And that's that version of how many of us are taught what happened during the 1960s in this country. That version, that's another example, I feel like, of that version, when you have a plaque in front of the headquarters of the civil rights movement in Selma in 1965 that says they gave their lives. That's just another version of that kind of softening of history that, getting back to my hectoring about the truth, I feel like it gets in our way of getting to the truth when we do that.
Yeah, I think it's just really, really hard to be honest about the consequences of the brutalities of the past. I think about this especially as it relates to slavery and the kinds of stories that are, I think we're in a moment right now where people are wanting to think seriously about what does it mean that this country was founded by slave owners, basically. That we can talk about that and we can mitigate that and we can expel it away in the ways that we have done pretty well with the way our history has operated up until now. But there's a moment, I think, that we're in where people are wanting to think more deeply about what does that mean, that was part of the foundation of the country. The New York Times 1619 Project, if anybody hasn't checked it out, would highly encourage you to check it out. 400-year anniversary of the first enslaved Africans to come to the United States. So it's a pretty incredible deep thinking of what is the legacy, what does it mean? This is what the lynching memorial does in Montgomery and what Brian's work does. But to answer the question about it, the martyrdom story is one that it can comfort us, and it can allow us to not have to think about the consequences of that being a murder, because a martyr doesn't leave behind. A martyr leaves behind a wonderful legacy. A martyr doesn't leave behind a grieving family. It's not how that narrative works. And so I do think, to Joanne's point, and it should be said too that, Joanne Bland is just someone that you have in the course of reporting, people that you become really attached to, like the Reeb family for us, but Joanne is one of those people that we are tremendously attached to, and she never took any was never a moment when when one of us would say something naive, usually me, that she wouldn't counter with something, just knocking me back in my place, and I would love her for that. But it should be said that one of the things she does, and what she was sort of doing on the radio for us, was doing what she does in front of children, because she takes school groups around. And so it's very important to her to counteract what the narrative of that monument does. The other thing that it does, which she likes to point out, which we didn't include in the show, is that the order of the names is that I believe it's Reeb on top, right? Reeb Liuzzo and then Jimmy Lee Jackson. And she wants the people who come on her tours to think about, why would it be that would be the order of those names? It's not the order of who died first. It's not the order. What is it about the order of those names that, and puts it back on the school groups, on the kids who are having to think through. It's funny to critique a monument that's celebrating these people, but if you think about what's deeper there, it's one thing to say there's a martyr and this is a story that we can tidily hand up, but how does that story get created, and what does its legacy mean?
When we were preparing the material for the program for tonight, it was interesting to me to kind of spend time with the 6 characters that are in the mural, and realize that 3 of them were murdered. Jimmy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Reverend Reeb. Murdered. They didn't give their lives, they were taken by hateful, racist murderers. Yeah, thank you. Leah, you were born and raised in Casper, and this is your place. These are your roots, and you were raised by, as we've talked about a little bit tonight, an incredibly loving family. And so this is really a deeply personal story for you, and you have uncovered the pieces of your identity as you've discovered more and more about your grandfather's legacy and what it means to you, how that plays out in your everyday life. So when it comes to this mural, why does it matter that your grandfather's story is told in the form of public art in his hometown, not kind of tucked into a museum, not, in a book somewhere, but like a public space that's easily accessible by all of the people at all of the times? Why does that matter to you, and what kind of impact do you anticipate it carrying forward?
I'll say that, Tony has created the life story of my grandfather and others on a wall that visually impacts you. And I hope that you all felt that when you saw it and were able to connect with it, at least from the Casper level of like, oh my gosh, that's NCHS, that's North Casper, that's fossil hunting in Wyoming. Those are things that I can touch myself today and do. And so I think we've talked about this before. I think the importance for me is that it allows people to connect with him as an everyday man, and that he wasn't just his death, but he was everything that was, before that. He was, a young man that attended NCHS and was in ROTC and, debate of all things, of course. That enjoyed getting out and hiking in Wyoming and fossil hunting with his family. And so for me, the connection and in the public art forum is the attraction of walking up to that mural and being curious about the story that's displayed there. I think the visual aspect of just the beauty of it, not only is the beauty of the story, but just the beauty of how Tony was able to create the story on the wall is something that will grab people's attention, and then hopefully, inspire people to learn more about all of the 6 individuals that were on that wall in their story, and be able to somehow relate to them, knowing that this man had roots in Casper, Wyoming. His family calls Casper, Wyoming home. We're proud of this community, and if someone like he can use his voice and his actions for the greater good of his community and beyond, why can't I do that as someone from here as well? So I think that's what resonated with me about having it on, 80 foot across the back of a building. So I guess that's what I would say about that. Yeah.
Wonderful. So another one of those like lightning sharp moments in the podcast comes in episode 7, and it's a moment in time when Katie Cook, who is the great granddaughter of Elmer Cook, who was really the one responsible for the most murderous blows to Reverend Reeb, seeks out the opportunity to connect with the Reeb family. And you all are talking at the back of a church after an event, and Katie's speaking with yourself, Leah, and with your Aunt Ann, and you're discussing about lineage and legacy and kind of some of the things we've been touching on tonight. And Katie has this quote that it has sat with me and sat with me. It's going to sit with me. It's going to be inside of me for my entire life. And it really kind of shaped a little bit of how we've talked about the mural publicly. But she has this quote where she says, "I am a firm believer that pain sparks empathy. And that empathy is the greatest human power. To be able to feel for others and relate to them is, I think, the most important thing in the world, because it's the only way that we are all going to share in this world. Without it, there is just chaos." So as journalists, you all have put together a piece of listening that really, it feels like art. I mean, I know it's journalism, but it feels like art, because it's just so, it's so impactful, and it's a little earworm. It gets inside of your, imagination, and it just wiggles around in there and makes you feel. How did this investigation increase your own empathy? And what choices were difficult to make for the podcast? What seemed obvious and what didn't? Yeah.
I mean, it is an extraordinary privilege to be able to tell a story as complex and interesting as this, and it's hard to even think about anything. I mean, there are many, many difficult choices, but it's such a joyous thing, and also to be given the support that NPR gave us to do this was really incredible. We had 7 hours to tell the story, and we still left out. I cannot imagine how much stuff we left out.
Yeah. This is a small thing, but I've been thinking about him since I've been in Casper a lot. This man, Al Lingo, who was a young, white civil rights worker, worked for the SCLC, Martin Luther King's organization, from 62, 63. Was working in St. Petersburg, was kind of really, following King as he moved his way across the South for different campaigns. And we interviewed him for, time stopped. He's a Buddhist now, and he has a meditation studio in his home in Atlanta. He and Andy Young get lunch every week. I mean, it's just this, it's like tapping into a different world and a different time. And when we interviewed him, it was late afternoon, and I think we both passed into another era and then came back. Some of the times we stopped. But he said all sorts of things. He speaks very slowly and methodically and thoughtfully, which makes him really easy to cut for radio. So we always thought of him as this wonderful voice for episode 7, because like Joanne, in some ways, he's able to tap into his own experiences, but he's able to make sense and process everything and sort of think about the story and think about what it means. And so we always thought about saving Al Lingo for the very end, and then we got to the very end, and as the show was, I shouldn't say this to a room full of people, but we didn't write the 7th episode, the last episode, until about two and a half weeks before it aired. And so as we were trying to put it together, we realized that it was just too late. It was too late to introduce a new character. It was too late to introduce this new voice who was not directly related to the story, but could help make sense of the story. And it was a really painful thing to lose him, and to sort of have a moment with Al Lingo and say goodbye, Al, and then not use him. But one of the things he said, and the reason that I've been thinking about him a lot this weekend, and we were talking about this earlier, is that kind of towards the end of our interview, we were talking about all these different things. He said, he's in his 80s?
Yeah,
mid-80s?
83.
He said, I've never known until these past several years just how much racism has affected my life. And this is a man who spent his formative years sort of on the front lines. I've never known until the past few years how much racism has affected my life. And the answer to that is that you probably do everything that you possibly can to fight it, to figure out how to remedy it, to reckon with it and grapple with it, and to repair it if that's possible. And you don't worry about looking good, because there's not any looking good that's doing very much help right now. And I think we have just thought about that a lot, and of course thinking about it as we've come and looking at the mural, and just the idea of doing everything you know how to do, and we're all different, so we do that in different ways, and we're fallible, and we screw up, and we're not perfect, and so we sometimes get it wrong, but just trying to do everything you can and just not worrying about looking good, I think is something that having never done radio before, we thought a lot about.
Leah, what was the experience like talking with Katie Cook, and how did it change your perspective?
So to fill everyone in on like how this Katie Cook thing came about, my Aunt Ann and I had traveled to Birmingham. When was that?
October?
Yeah, fall.
Yeah.
And
Late summer in Alabama.
we went late summer in Alabama. Yeah, quite an experience.
First
going
month of
from
skiing
here.
season here.
Right. So we had gone to Birmingham to be interviewed by the UU church there that is doing a documentary film on civil rights martyrs that are tightly associated with the UU church. And so we went down to be interviewed about my grandfather. And in a few days before arriving there, the producer called and said, I've got something kind of heavy on my heart and I need to tell you and see if you'd want to be a part of this. But she said, we did a sort of a trial run of the film at the university, and then we did some table discussions, and shortly after we did that, a young lady came up to us and said, I'm Elmer Cook's granddaughter, great-granddaughter, and great-granddaughter, and I'm pretty sure that he killed James Reeb, and I didn't know anything about this. This is the first time I'm ever hearing about this, and so she knows she's 20, somewhere around there, and so they kind of had a relationship, and she came and chatted with the producers a little bit more, and and in that process voiced her interest in meeting with the Reeb family if there was ever an opportunity. Just in passing said, if there's ever an opportunity to meet with somebody, I just want to tell them that I'm sorry and I didn't realize that this had happened. She had ended up going back after seeing that film and Googling her great-grandfather's name and learning the story about what happened in Selma. And so, the producer calls my aunt and I and said, if you want, I can arrange some time to meet her. And so we kind of talked about it with family and decided, okay, well, we're going to meet her. So we went to a church service, and Annie and Chip came along because they were in Birmingham as well. We sat down with her, and she was very nervous and didn't know quite what to say. You got to hear her if you listened to the podcast in that final episode. But the first thing when the producer came to us and said, I've got this young lady that's the great-granddaughter of Elmer, and she wants to meet you, my mind went to my nieces, who are the same exact age range of her. And I thought to myself, and she had mentioned something about having some guilt, and I thought, I would never want my nieces to have any guilt for anything that generations before them did, and I would want Katie to know that our family would never put that on her. That would never be something that we would want her to have guilt for in her heart. And so if I'm going to meet her, that's the one thing I want to convey to her, that her and I, we're there, so there's several generations between us. I'm granddaughter and she's great-granddaughter, that we now get to learn and make our own choices and have our own voice. We don't have to live in the shadows of our past and who we come from. You can choose to do that, but you don't have to. And so it's your opportunity to live your truth and how you're going to approach your life. And so we got to have a really candid discussion with her, and she got to tell us about her side and where she grew up and what she grew up in. We got to answer questions to her about what it felt like being on the other side of that. And so I think it was, for me, a powerful moment to see that kind of generations coming together that were on opposite sides affected by this tragic story of loss, and someone that took the life of someone else but had to live in the shadows of that, at least her grandfather, the son of Elmer Cook. And so it was a pretty powerful moment, and it was kind of at the last second that Katie was okay with being recorded, and it ended up in that final episode. If you've not listened, it was a pretty powerful moment. So.
Okay, I'm not going to follow that rabbit trail. Ammon, this mural is, like we've said, it's a public piece of art. And I'm curious, do you have a sense of what kind of stories you hope a piece like this can begin to create a new ripple effect, a new wake kind of forward in Wyoming. This mural didn't shy away from telling harsh truth from an inspiring story, but what can it spark in our state? And what stories are you going to be telling when you return to Laramie?
Yeah, I mean, I think it sparks an opportunity to tell the story. I didn't know about the story until you called and asked me to come up, you know, and then I listened to White Lies and started doing all this reading, and I was like, oh, like, here in Wyoming, you know, like I think we often think of the civil rights movement as something that happens far away, right? It happened in the South, it's disconnected, we're in isolation, like it's just like different, right? Like I imagine often like this big wall, especially when I was a kid growing up, like I'm Western, that didn't have anything to do with me, you know. We just drove people off their land. We had our own, right? But it was like separate. And I think the story that it has the opportunity to tell is that now it's up and it's here, and we have a whole room full of people that live and interact and spend every day in Casper. And Wyoming is, you know, as a state, just one small town. Mm-hmm. And so really we have an opportunity to tell this story across Wyoming. Like, to tell people what happened, to tell people that Wyoming has always advocated for civil rights. Wyoming has always advocated for equity. And like that history is our history. And I think the story that I will tell, that I've been thinking a lot about Casper, is that, you know, you started a group to put, you know, I think the tagline is disciples and doubters, right? And someone in the doubting column who has a very complicated relationship with religion. And it's often hard for me to go sit down at church. And it's hard for me to go and take part of that place that was once such a home for me that now feels so poisonous often. And to see like this kind of work being done and to interact alongside of churches as we were fighting against white supremacy, but to see that like a group of people got together and sought and still seeks, you know, human empathy and like seeks equity. And it's not like let's talk in despair. It's like what's happening here in our hometown, what has happened in our hometown. And out of that group and out of those conversations that you all had around that table, you realize the importance of holding up the story of your heroes, and that who we hold up as a hero of our community matters. And from the group of doubters and, you know, disciples getting together, from the interaction of human beings sitting down seeking the good of other humans, that's the story, you know, that's been lifted up. A shining example of it in the past, you know, through his social work, through his seeking of equality, and that it's being carried forward. You know, I know some folks here who are doing some really remarkable organizing and really remarkable work, and I think, you know, that in Laramie we have a mural project, you know, and we have the Black 14 who stood up and, you know, who were let go for asking if they could protest BYU, right? And for asking if they could protest that. And we have a mural of the wings in honor of Matthew Shepard, those angel wings that were a barrier. And I think that like the more we not only remember these stories, but celebrate them like we are tonight, it's a ripple effect. It's one story told on a mural, but it's hundreds of thousands of stories across Wyoming, you know? And I think it makes a huge difference to folks who have lived in these communities. You know, I talk to people who are from Casper, and I told them what I was doing, and every single one of them are so proud and so happy and excited that this is what their home is doing. And every single one of them told me, that makes home a little more welcoming, right? Like, that makes home feel like it's for me. And I think that telling that story that, you know, home is becoming home to a lot more Wyomingites with every one of these steps we take is the story that I'll kind of keep and that I'm really excited about.
Thank you for crystallizing that for us. that encourages me that these next steps are going to be really important. So thank you. If this has been an evening for you where you have had your perspective widened, softened, strengthened, encouraged, would you thank our panelists for their work tonight? Thank you so much. It's a powerful thing to know that we're not alone in this journey, and this room represents that. As we conclude tonight, we would be remiss without a deeply heartfelt expression of gratitude specifically to the Reeb family. Thank you for participating. Thank you for, I'm sure at times unwillingly, but compassionately and graciously sharing your story with your community. Your roots here have inspired this mural and have inspired many of us, and you are loved and supported, and we're excited that this gets to move forward. At the end of the night, Grandma Marie, I'm gonna give these to you, so these are coming your way. We love you so much. Friends, as we go now, in question for each of us to take away from this space is the invitation to consider what is in our wake. That mural, there was a wake connected to every single one of those marchers. And so the question for us tonight is, what's our influence? What's our light? What's our impact? What's our willingness to move towards justice and away from fear? I'm going to close this out like we always do here at the table. And if you are able-bodied and willing, it would help us go a long way if you would just pick up your chair. And if you're not able-bodied, no big deal, we'll have extra hands. But if you would just pick up your chair, there's some racks right inside of these doors that will willingly accept those chairs. But let us go now from this place to love and serve each other so that those to whom love is a stranger might find in us generous friends. Go in peace. Thank you.